COVID-19 situation?
Well, I think, this is the moment actually when corporate governance becomes most important, because this is the moment when boards have to be making key decisions, existential decisions about their organizations. Of course, many of the rules of the game, the sort of standard governance rules that we often talk about, such as accountability to shareholders, accountability to creditors, have changed because of emergency measures. So some aspects of our corporate governance world have been frozen or have been fundamentally altered temporarily. But the heart of governance is actually the functioning of the board of directors. It's the interaction between board members. It's the quality of the decisions that they make, and that is unchanged. So really, I think now corporate governance is as important as ever.
Roberta, picking up on Roger's opening remarks, do you feel that Maltese directors are actually taking quality decisions at this point in time?
Well, I don't want to sound presumptuous, so I don't assume to know what everybody is doing. I can obviously speak from my knowledge of the businesses and the boards that I am in touch with. And I think, if I may, I would feel that the decisions they are making are mainly out of a situation of panic. In the sense that this is a situation that we had never had to face before. It is very much likely that nothing of the sort was ever envisaged, and I feel that most boards and most directors were until now planning for growth. So something like this, which has actually shocked the whole ecosystem, but also really undermined all the planning and the growth prospects of all of these companies, and instead has made them shift towards a mindset of survival. I would say they were caught completely unaware, and I think that decisions are being made mainly out of a situation of panic rather than quality decisions. Having said that, I also think that the help which government is offering, without going into the merits of how good it is or how effective it's going to be, but at least it has given people some time to stop and reflect. It has helped them to buy time, a few weeks' time, so that perhaps it allows them a few weeks to reflect on their prospects going forward and maybe be able to make better decisions.
Well, we certainly have a situation where I've been told by numerous directors and chairs and CEOs over the last 2 or 3 weeks that Malta's company law and other legislation is adding to this panic because it's rather unforgiving. And in fact, in the UK, for example, there's been a suspension or an easing of the wrongful trading legislation. How can we help directors in Malta by relaxing the different legislative frameworks a little bit so that they can breathe somewhat more comfortably?
Well, really, I think the effort should be on what has been done so far, in the sense that everybody needs to work together and propose solutions which are bottom up, in the sense, if we look at the packages, the support packages again that are being offered by government, they are the result of extensive consultation and proposals that have been made by the relative professional bodies. So I really think that dialogue is key to making sure that any measures that are introduced or that are proposed, whether these are legislative measures or financial measures, they really reflect the needs and expectations of the ultimate beneficiaries, or the ones that are going to be impacted by these decisions. So again, dialogue, 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 I think it's key, but in a way which is agile. So
Yes.
we need to talk, yes, but we also need to be agile.
Could I just make the point, Edwin, that our governments have been taking these steps with unprecedented speed. That it really has been policy making on the hoof. We have never seen anything like this in the past. So I think we do need to be ready as an Institute of Directors in Malta to to give feedback and, where necessary, to push back actually against government. If things aren't working correctly. This is not, I think, the environment for us to just say, well, let's wait and see, give it a month or two to bed down. These are emergency measures, and if they're not working, then I think you need to be ready to give that feedback to government and tell them where they need to go.
I think the situation, Roberta, this is something that I'm sure you've also got a lot of exposure to. The situation in Malta is that there is still a lot of different government departments, the policy makers, and then the final administrators for the different programs. The lines are not necessarily particularly clear cut. So we have the situation where there's some uncertainty about who qualifies for what. And then beyond this uncertainty, there are difficulties dealing with certain institutions. One example of this would be the banks, where while government is saying, don't lay anyone off, rely on the emergency measures to keep your teams in place. The banks are saying, well, that's all very well, but you need to cut your costs by 75%. Otherwise, we're not going to help you any further. So there is this disconnect. And I think, the most important dialogue right now is how to correct that disconnect so that people who are in fragile businesses or distressed businesses can get the help that they need right now, and not in 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 weeks time or longer. Banks are still asking for 6 to 12 months cash flow.
Well, at this stage, cash flow forecasting, I think anything beyond a month or two is just wishful thinking. So yes, there is this aspect of disconnect. I think, as harsh as this sounds, perhaps a company should plan its path going forward without perhaps factoring in the support of the government. One, because as you said, nobody knows what they're entitled to, at least here, or not necessarily, but some areas are grey. And two, also because this support, whatever it is going to come to an end. It's not going to last forever. So in terms of survival, one, I think, really needs to project its own prospects without the support. And then if the support comes through, well, that would be just an added bonus.
Do you feel from a legal standpoint, for example, that we need to see some changes to the insolvency rules?
Well, yes, possibly. Obviously, if directors or boards are consulting lawyers, a lawyer will always advise on the worst case scenario. So they will advise on what could possibly happen in the worst of situations. However, let's also be slightly more pragmatic and realize that there's a process until that worst case scenario materializes. So I don't think there's need to panic. I think there's good reason to be aware of possible consequences. But I think once again, with the right dialogue, with creditors, with banking institutions, possibly with clients and all the relevant stakeholders, I think we can go forward even without any legislative changes at this stage. Any help, as I said, from the legislative side, from the financial side, but then is also welcome. But I think we can work with what we have.
Charlotte, we haven't heard from you yet, but given that there is this unprecedented situation, has it forced a rethink in terms of what the IoD's role could be or should be?
I think this presentation, so this situation, looking at the things we've talked about already, is forcing a rethink in all areas. I serve on the board of 6 different companies, very different organizations, from large construction company through IoD to loan financing company. And we have to look at all the things at all the times that could and should change. I happen to also live in Jersey, which is not dissimilar to Malta. So I understand the economy around a small country and how you need to, that is very dependent on offshore services as well. So I think it's very helpful if we look towards each other and what we do. And the sharing of knowledge and experiences is very helpful. If governments have seen a change already happen in another country, like Malta can look to the UK around online AGMs, the more practicalities, they should look to that and feel comfortable that other countries have already implemented it, and therefore the process should be shorter. In a sense, a lot of the due diligence around it has already been done. This is not a black swan event, right? People like to think that it is, but black swan events are unpredictable. This was predictable. We've had a number of viruses coming before this that we managed to stop. It was unavoidable that one day there would be one that couldn't be stopped. So I think we have to, one, realize that we prefer to close our eyes for the possibility of this happening. 2, stop doing it for the future, right? That goes for all the organizations I'm on the board of, whether it's IoD, Langeroog, Blackstone, whichever one it is. We have to try to look at this as a new normal. If we don't do that, we're not going to move on in the right gear. And as Roberta was saying, we have to understand that even if there is temporary state measures, government measures to help, they will go away again. Right now in the UK, we can furlough people. That's only till June. By July, we'll have everybody back on the books at full salaries. We should not close our eyes to that fact. If we have spent 2-3 months first losing a part of our income, and then going forward, when will it actually come back? So yes, absolutely, the IoD has to rethink everything, and so does all other organizations I work with. The new normal is not fully clear yet. But we can certainly see certain things in that we will come out of lockdown, yes. But will people go back to work in the old way? No. Will we have mass gatherings the next 1 to 2 years? Personally, I don't think so. I think we'll be limited by 50. This is what we'll have to get used to being more in, and we'll have to just accept it and stop wanting to go back to what used to be. That's over. And that's the best way we can help ourselves. Peer governance is a key thing for me. We need many people to give us input into what we do. We need to set up informal networks so we can draw on all the intellect, knowledge, and insight we have everywhere. And this is something Roger and I are already working on with the Center for Corporate Governance that we would also like to see in other countries such as Malta. We could then interact between the centers on the kind of things that we should learn from each other and feed that globally, without anyone else really having to feed into it, but we are having these centers feeding into one voice that we can all feed further into our different governments. Sorry, that was a lot in one go. But yes, everything needs to change is the bottom line.
How has the IoD changed over the last few weeks, Charlotte?
So we haven't changed yet, but we are looking at everything there is to look at. We have to look at the fact that our PD delivery momentarily has stopped. Our hospitality and events have stopped, and therefore we have lost more than half of our income. With that, in a period of time, we'll have to right size our cost base accordingly to our income base. All companies are in the same situation. We also have to look to when will we be able to come back. So we're putting PD courses online rapidly now. so that, which we haven't done before. We want to be able to deliver our chartered online. We're pushing into from May start developing the trainers, so train the trainers, projects that we have talked about already. So we are pushing in a lot more. We have this increased collaboration with universities, but all universities and business schools are in a very difficult situation right now. They are not sure if their students can come back in September. I have two sons in university. We don't know if any of them are going back. Currently, they're here finalizing their last term. So everything is in the air. Key thing for all businesses, you must cut your costs so that you're not bleeding to death for however long this takes. And you must cut it enough for a situation where we might come out of lockdown, then back into it again in the autumn. Then we might come out, we might come back in. Then we might have another virus. We just have to focus on that. You know, there are good things coming with this and opportunities, and we have to look at those opportunities, such as online connectivity, as we're doing here.
So we can, in short, expect an extended crisis, maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 phases. We don't know how many phases yet. We have government measures which are partially going to help support the social distancing measures of phase 1. And we can't anticipate what will be coming in other phases. But we certainly already do have, Roberta, quite a lot of distressed companies here, dealing with a lot of contractual problems around supply chain, around employment contracts. Where can we maybe have some low-hanging fruit in all of this to help companies get through it?
I wish I had the answer to that, Edwin. I think the situation of every company is particular. I don't think there's any solution which is going to fit any group or any industry, because everybody has to assess the situation within their own circumstances. What I do feel, though, that it's going to take all of our creativity to come up with new solutions. Obviously, we cannot look back at what we have done in the past, but we have to come up with new ideas, new solutions, new processes, and we really need to reinvent what we are doing. I think unless we innovate, we're going to die. So definitely that. And as a country, I think we haven't done particularly well in terms of innovation in the past. So this is once again our opportunity. You know, sometimes with a little bit of pressure, we can come up with solutions that perhaps we weren't really, we didn't have any sense of urgency to implement before. So hopefully we'll see some creative and innovative ideas and new ways of doing things coming out of all of this.
We're certainly seeing a lot of companies trying to quickly reinvent their business models. And that's a very fundamental change at board level, which is discussing different kinds of business model and trying to understand what the implications of adopting those business models might be, particularly without having, in some cases, much experience of digital or digitalization or some of the other bigger concepts around this, like big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the cloud. You know, it's an entire vocabulary which today boards are going to have to come to wrestle with very quickly. What, Roger, in your view, is the implication of companies moving so rapidly to go online, knowing that there are problems with cybersecurity and GDPR and many other possible pitfalls of going online? What are the governance issues in there?
Well, I mean, I suppose the first governance issue which arises is the board in a position to actually understand these issues and identify the right options. You know, who are the right people to advise it? Do they have the right people on the board who can understand it? Who can consider the right alternatives? And I suppose many boards are not in that position at the moment. I mean, we've been talking about this for a number of years, the need to sort of change the composition of the board in a way which actually matches the nature of current business realities. But I would suggest that that's happened only partially. I mean, we tend to have the same types of people with the same sort of background sitting on the board from a sort of general business, financial, perhaps past CEO type backgrounds. But now we have to address these issues as a matter of urgency. I think that's going to really renew. I mean, this whole crisis really does present anew that governance question of who do we need on the board of directors? You know, what are the right skills for now? They're probably quite different skills compared to those that were needed a year ago when things were looking very much more rosy. It was a growth phase. Now we're into a completely different phase, thinking about different technology, completely sort of different type of business scenario. Possibly that will need a new type of director. Possibly that will need a different type of CEO as well, and management team.
Well, it certainly will need a new CEO because all the CEOs that have been hired, well, I speak here on the Malta side. Malta has been averaging between 6.5% GDP growth over the last few years. And most of the CEOs have come in when the going is good. The markets were expanding quite rapidly in their own right for Maltese companies. And the CEOs that were hired were essentially CEOs with the skills to grow the business. Their main activity was to wake up every morning and dream and implement growth. And in a month, all of this has changed. And the same people that were hired to grow these businesses are now probably in need of being fired, because what you need is a specialist who can dig you out of a hole. And this is a very special kind of leader that can turn situations like this around. And I'm sure we'll see many CEOs having to bite the bullet in the coming weeks. Charlotte, in your mind, what does the new type of director for this generation look like?
So I think, I mean, both for director, non-executive and executive directors, I have advocated for shifts in board compositions for many years. And I think this is making it very clear that in a very rapid happening crisis like this, actually you need to have some agility at the board where you can maybe co-opt board members that are crisis style board members to the boards pretty quickly. And at the same time, if you haven't got technology skills, you can co-opt that into the board as well very rapidly. I think we need to stop thinking at board position as something you do for 10 to 15 years for sure. 9 years should be the maximum, but maybe it's even 6 years. And we need to be able to say, well, do you know what? We need another kind of director for a year now. With CEOs, that's the same. It depends really on the sort of leadership maturity profile of both the board and the CEO. But if the CEO has a high level leadership maturity profile, they would understand when the skills that they have are not good enough anymore. And they would either know their weaknesses enough to be able to point out and say, in this area, I need some support, extra support for a period of time to ensure we can make the right decisions. The board might need to say the same, again, by co-opting directors for a short period of time to support them in the boardroom with full visibility of everything. So I think agility is really what we need. Board has not traditionally been super agile. They have tend to be taking sometimes long time making decisions. We haven't got time. We have to be ready to make decisions quickly. And if we have CEOs that can't or won't make decisions, the board has to be brave enough to then take over that and ask for enough information that they can make decisions, all of them together, to really push the agenda on. So I think definitely younger directors, definitely technology directors. Obviously, the gender balance speaks for itself. I have seen very interesting patterns on boards where there is a clear difference between the thinking of men and women in very tight situations and rapid crises like this, where effectively what we're talking about is life or economy. So as we all know, you flatten the curve, you deepen the recession. So which one are you more concerned with? The life or the economy? And some people need to actually be ill themselves or lose someone in family before they can start thinking of life, as opposed to economy. And other people can only think of life and not economy. None of those work, right? It has to be a balance of the two. And the two of them together balancing each other up is perfect. If you go only one way or the other, it's a disaster, either a human disaster or financial disaster. Again, this just reinforces why we need the kind of board compositions that I've been talking about for a long time.
I think this is an absolutely brilliant new definition of work-life balance. You know, we've spoken in so many different ways about this over the years, but you know, now we've hit it in the crunch, and it's a very meaningful sound to it, life or work. Very meaningful. How is
to the broader stakeholder discussion that Roger is having as well, and we're having in the center? It is much more. It's not just about profit. Right now, it's about prosperity. Prosperity for all, right?
Yeah. Although, of course, as people have been pointing out, that trade-off between, should we say, health and the economy is not a simple trade-off, is it?
No.
Because if
that costs lives as well.
Yes, it does. If the economy is on its back, a lot of people suffer. A lot of people suffer through unemployment, through loss of income, loss of opportunities. So it's a very complex, issue.
If I may add to this, definitely complex, and I don't think anybody has a magic wand and the right solution, but I totally agree that we need to be shifting our mindsets from GDP to perhaps indicators of well-being. And as complex as this is, there are frameworks that we can follow. So it's not as if we have to reinvent everything from scratch. There are frameworks and processes that we can follow to at least give us a basic understanding of where we can start from and where we should be heading. So the knowledge is there. What we need is, as you said, Charlie, the maturity to understand that we need to change.
Yeah.
And this is a change that seems to be taking root even prior to the crisis. The US Roundtable, which is a very influential group of businesses in the United States, they, for the first time in their history, challenged the supremacy of shareholder primacy, and actually knocked the idea of making a profit down to about 5th or 6th on their stated aims and objectives and priorities for the modern business. So I think we're seeing an enormous shift in how the market is beginning to conceive of business and the role of business in society to drive different kinds of platforms. You and I, Roberta, had an event recently where we spoke about sustainability.
Correct.
In a lot of detail. But I think survival and sustainability are now twinned in this new situation. Don't you agree?
Certainly. I think more than anything, this crisis has also showed us how things can and will change if we don't pay attention to certain issues that we had been sidelining, such as climate change, for instance, because the reality is that we were already facing a crisis. It just didn't fall upon on us suddenly, so we weren't really treating it as a crisis. So this is also an opportunity for us to change or shift the way we do things going forward to avert further negative consequences and hopefully shift things around to be able to have more positive outcomes. Also within the context of global trend where also trust in politicians and non-profits is declining, and it is the employer who enjoys the ultimate trust of employees. So again, employers or business owners have a responsibility, but also an opportunity to shape the national and global agenda going forward, because they are the ones who ultimately retain the trust of the people.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the stated purpose of corporations or private sector entities, we seem to be going through an unprecedented and rapid change in thinking about purpose. This is going to have quite an impact on corporate governance, isn't it, Roger?
I think yes, it is. Certainly, if you're thinking about which stakeholders have been most important or which are key during the last few months of this crisis, really shareholders haven't been there, have they? They've taken a back seat. I mean, it's been government, which would like it or not, which has been the key shareholder, the key stakeholder, and it's been the need to keep people employed, to maintain the workforce in some semblance of normality. That's been of crucial importance. Shareholders have had to take a back seat. Now, of course, where that could change a bit in the future is if companies are looking to capital markets, to equity markets, to raise funds to further sustain themselves. I think there's going to have to almost be so. The question then is, will equity investors support that? The evidence so far, though, is that they are doing that. They're not doing that, of course, through traditional methods like IPOs. What we've seen in the US is a lot of smaller companies are going to equity markets and managing to sell their shares at significant discounts to market price, and thereby circumventing the need for IPOs, complicated bureaucratic prospectus requirements, the need to pay a lot of money to investment banks and so on, and achieving their fundraising in that way. But certainly for now, it hasn't been shareholders in the front seat. And I think we're just going to have to recognize reality going forward, that the corporation is a multi-stakeholder entity which depends on a variety of stakeholders. The importance of particular stakeholders may vary in different types of organization. And it's really each organization to determine, the prioritization and to balance the interests of the different stakeholders. But whereas at the moment, what we have is in company law, an outright prioritization of the shareholders.
Yeah. True.
Yes, well, we certainly have that enshrined in Malta's company law. It's 136A, which sets out the duties under which the shareholder will be protected, and the duties and responsibilities of the directors towards the shareholder. We haven't yet moved to this multi-stakeholder situation, but I think coming back on the private sector becoming an effective backseat driver to a government-led recovery. It'd be interesting to have you were an investment banker, Charlotte. What is your view? Can this level of stakeholder engagement, can it be sustainable itself? Because really, investors want their money back, and they want it back fast, don't they?
I think it is becoming more and more the new normal. It is, I mean, just yesterday I read what is Exxon was voted against for the whole board because they weren't taking serious enough steps around the environment. Certainly, there has been a lot of activism around boards in the UK, listed boards that aren't diverse enough, and you simply get voted off the board. So they are voting with their feet, and a lot of the global investors, they have the concern for the whole. I mean, the bottom line for me is that any organization that has built themselves in a country could only do that because that country had people and a government and an infrastructure, roads and schools and hospitals. Without the people there, none of that would be there, and there would be no possibility for anyone to make themselves rich. Everyone makes money because there is people. No people, no money. It's that simple. And I think that people forget that is, or boards sometimes and organizations forget that their ultimate stakeholders are always the people of the country they run their business in. And I think that is something we must not forget. We have a duty as directors to serve the best of the public and in the country we are in. And I think that is a duty sometimes we might forget. There is a lot of pressures in different countries around changing the company's law to have that broader stakeholder as a legal condition for being a director of a company. So to go away from that, personally, I think that's a good idea. Officially, as the chair of the IoD, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that on a personal capacity because I think we need to put some of that into law. The broader stakeholders are all of us. And I think this crisis might help us understand that we're all part of the one. We're all part of one big cell. And when we do something bad to that cell, we effectively do something bad to ourselves. Coincidentally, when we do something good to that cell, we do something good to ourselves. And what we see in this crisis is that environmental damage is coming down. We are seeing animals walking freely around in cities. We're seeing clear waters in Venice. All of this good stuff. In India, they can suddenly see the mountains they haven't seen for 30 years. At least it gives some awareness of what the damage we're doing, and hopefully we can hold on to that. And the younger generations can be really awakened to see this is something we want to make a difference in. And if we get enough people that are stakeholders and have an interest in any organization, the pressure will be hard for any board to ignore that, even if they are not shareholders, in my view. So yes, I think it is sustainable. I think it will happen. I think investors will accept that their returns are going to be less overall, but because of the bigger picture. And I think businesses would slowly understand that profit is going to be a poo-poo word, and they're going to stop talking about it and talk about people, planet, and prosperity instead.
Yeah.
So basically, in a nutshell, boards and businesses are going to have to learn how to be more expressive about idealism in different ways. And we spoke earlier about small economies, and one of the features of small economies is that they can become extremely fragile extremely quickly. And one of the problems I think that we're experiencing here, where stakeholders are not recognizing their duties towards one another, Roberta, is in this cycle of debt, where companies are sitting on cash piles and they're not paying their supply chains. And the courts are only available for absolute emergencies, urgent, but isn't it urgent that your debtors are not paying you, and therefore you cannot pay your employees? Isn't that urgent?
I would think so, Edwin. I don't think I don't know if anybody has tested this in our courts yet. I'm not aware of it, at least. I would like to think that debtors are delaying payments rather than deciding not to honor their commitments. And I think it's also because, as we mentioned earlier, people are just waiting and hoping that things will go back to normal very soon. So perhaps it's a delaying tactic, also within perhaps a framework of people having had long-standing relationships and banking on the fact that the creditor will wait out a little bit longer, although obviously there are problems with that, because usually the suppliers tend to be the smaller organizations who also rely on these relationships for their own survival. So I think it ultimately boils down as well to a sense of personal decency of the person taking the decision, and really trying to factor in the impact on everybody involved rather than just on their own organization or on their own situation. So really, again, understanding that we are part of a whole rather than just looking at ourselves as an individual entity.
Well, the problem is that under the current situation, the entire ecosystem is damaged when one person defaults on payments. It travels very quickly down the line. There's a knock-on effect, and I imagine that there are many conversations going on in boardrooms at the moment about exactly what to do in this situation, because it seems a classic case of a standoff at the moment, where there have been very good policy statements made about government guarantees and other kinds of financial mechanisms that will kick into place in order to help our country's SMEs. We've got more than 97% of our entire economy based on the on having a healthy SME and family business market. So this delay in payment is extremely worrying for the smaller businesses, because they go to the bank and find no comfort. The administrative cycle has not yet kicked in on a cash flow level. So government policy is not reaching the coffers of the individual companies. And we're going to start feeling that very soon in the economy, where those who are on salaries of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 a month are simply surviving on €800. And this is essentially because we do have a problem in servicing debt. What do you see as a remedy to that?
Is this for me, Edwin? I'm not quite addressed to me.
Yeah.
Well, I think going back to what I said earlier, it boils down to effective communication. I think people need to really talk to each other rather than avoid each other, and really be frank about how much they can withstand and how much they can delay, and really coming up with perhaps compromises which somehow address or balance out the different needs. And I think once again, this leads us to perhaps reconsider how much we're making use of possibilities and remedies relating to alternative dispute resolution rather than the traditional court mechanisms. I think these are all methods which are more agile, which are more human, which are more flexible, and that we could resort to even in times of crisis like this, because if one perhaps goes to mediation or arbitration rather than having to go to court, perhaps these are mechanisms that we can implement also through digital channels. So once again, I think we need to really rethink the way we do things and the way we approach things. And we also need to realize that we already have a lot of tools in hand, but perhaps we haven't really been making good use of them. We don't really need to create everything from scratch. There's a lot that we can revisit.
For the Maltese company directors and CEOs who are on this call, Roberta, what are the sources of mediation and arbitration here? Who can boards confidently go to and get a remedy?
in terms of suppliers, unless there's an arbitration clause in the relative agreements, I don't think they can be resorted to. So unfortunately, unless they had been catered for before this happened, I don't think we can make use of them at this stage. So it's more of a learning curve, I suppose, going forward, how we can plan to better address similar challenges in the future.
So what we're saying here is that in principle, mediation and arbitration is a good idea, but it very much depends on the goodwill of the two parties.
Definitely. There has to be agreement on both sides to resort to these kind of mechanisms. Unfortunately, us Maltese tend to be quite contentious in nature. We do like the good old fight. So again, it boils down to the maturity that Charlotte mentioned earlier and our acknowledgement that we need to change things. And when we talk of innovation, it is not just technology which brings about innovation. Sometimes it's just making use of these new processes or different processes or approaches, which help us to just change, adapt, or just shift a little bit, just to be a little bit more practical, more efficient, more agile.
I definitely agree, Roberta, with some of that. Sorry, Roger. Some of that. I think looking to what we used to do and use some of that too. I mean, so mediation, in Jersey, we set up a resolution center, which is developing Jersey mediators every year. I'm a mediator myself as well. And we have different areas we specialize in. Boards is one of them, because boards often is helpful to have a third person come in and help them mediate in situations. But I think also countries should consider in the new normal to become much more self-sustainable, right? Because that's how you withstand a shock like this better. If you produce your own energy, your renewable energy or whatever it might be, if you produce more of your own food. I mean, right now we will get into a food crisis if every single country citizens don't start getting out in the fields and get those vegetables in the ground, right? And this is from America, UK through, it's everywhere. So if we in the UK have furloughed a lot of people, well, maybe they can help with the vegetables, right? Because that's for everybody's welfare, and actually have more of a community spirit. Maybe the old military drafting that we used to have in Denmark, where I come from, something like that, but for community drafting in crisis, because we might get more of it. So if you're healthy and okay and the distance is kept, maybe there are community jobs that has to be done to make society go round. And it's not just the military you bring in, it's everybody. We're all part of the whole. Again, it's back to that. And that spirit we had more of, I think, back in the last century, possibly. And I think we need to come back to that. We need to consider the whole renewable energy, the Green Deal they're doing in Europe. We are more countries that needs to consider that and be self-sufficient within our countries. I mean, Malta could produce lots of food. Any country can. Now you can do it on shelves vertically. You don't even have to have the land, right? We need to think like this and fast. Sorry, Roger.
I was just going to say, actually, Edwin, this is a very topical issue in the UK. Just even today, in fact, a group of former Supreme Court judges issued a call basically for companies to move to mediation, to not rush to litigate. That they really shouldn't be doing that. Of course, we in the UK I think have taken further steps than you have in Malta, in terms of protecting against creditors. A number of things have happened. A number of government steps have taken place. One, the possibility of directors being pursued for wrongful trading has been temporarily suspended. So that's one measure. In terms of landlords pursuing tenants who are not paying their rent, which is a very significant problem, because the figures which came out actually in today's media said that at the last rent payment date, at the end of last month, about 40% of commercial tenants didn't pay their rent. They basically declined to pay. And so landlords, of course, at this point, were very keen to pursue their interest it's already been made temporarily not possible to suspend a commercial lease in the UK. But that hasn't actually stopped landlords pursuing other legal mechanisms like seeking a statutory notice of non-payment of a debt, and also trying to pursue through the courts winding up petitions in respect of companies. A piece of news which occurred just in the last day or so is the government has actually announced that it won't be possible for commercial landlords to actually pursue those routes any longer either. So they can't pursue winding up petitions, they can't pursue statutory notices, and they can't a termination of a commercial lease. So that's all been put on hold. And in a way, I suppose that forces now the two sides, at least in terms of landlords and tenants, to pursue mediation in the interim, because there are no other real options. I suppose in your case, perhaps the stumbling block for someone pursuing legal action is the fact that courts aren't just there for them; they're not available for them. So that pushes them in that direction. But I really think that the idea that you at this point that you're going to commence some kind of legal court-based process in pursuit of non-payments is just it's just not practical. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, it's bringing up a very interesting point, which is when it comes to commercial leases, one of the things that many companies have started to understand is that they can actually work pretty much as productively as they did prior to the crisis, really taking hold of the community in the form of social distancing. And they've realized that instead of having 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 square meters of space, they can actually work with about 25% of that, and then rotate their people into the office periodically across the week. Some people come in Monday and Thursday, others come in Tuesday and Friday, and we're starting to see this rotation. And we're also seeing a change in the utilization aspect where, for example, in order to cut overheads rapidly, energy is not being used on multiple floors in the same building of a single organization. They're working in a much more confined space. So probably coming out the backside of this first phase of measures, we'll see many people wanting to pare down the amount of commercial space that they are holding. Have you come across many commercial lease disputes, Rob?
Not at this stage, no. I think it's more commercial lease worries that I have come across. I don't think they have evolved to the level of a dispute yet, as people are kind of waiting things out, hoping, as I mentioned earlier, that everything will go back to normal very soon. So no, very few. I mean, some people have just decided not to pay their leases. But not many have turned into official disputes yet, although obviously some people would have picked up the phone and voiced their reaction to the whole situation. I think, I at the risk of repeating myself, I think really it boils down to effective communication and really trying to balance out everybody's needs, and we can't do that unless we talk to each other. So the more we ignore each other, the more we hope that this isn't happening and wait for things to go back to normal, the more things are going to aggravate. So we really need to be talking to each other.
On the network of directors associations and understanding what kinds of concerns other institutes outside of Malta have had. Roger, there were some very good recommendations made by the Slovenian Institute of Directors on measures that should be taken around the pandemic. Were you involved in helping to draft those recommendations?
No, I wasn't. No,
Okay.
Are these general recommendations for boards or for policymakers?
Yes, these were suggestions to the government in Slovenia from the Slovenian Directors Association. For example, talking about having the domino effect that might take place due to insolvency, for example, and asking the government to suspend the provisions of the Insolvency Act and to extend generally insolvency proceedings in different ways. I think the idea here was to deal with this whole corporate liquidity issue.
Yeah.
But
that's very much mirrored. That's very much mirrored what we've been advocating in the UK, actually.
Right.
The first jurisdiction which took steps to actually suspend this wrongful trading liability was actually Australia, and then we were very keen to introduce that as well in the UK, and that has happened.
I think this is back to learning from each other, right?
Yes,
we
yes,
have
absolutely.
to look at what other. I mean, Spain came in quickly as well, quicker than the UK. Again, we can lean on what the other countries do and the due diligence they have already done around, because our company structure is not that different. These are global issues.
Absolutely. And I think one other interesting thing, which I think, Edwin, you might be your listeners might be interested in relation to insolvency, relates to an approach that the accounting firms have been taking, or some of them at least have been taking in the UK in respect of administration. If a company goes into administration, then normally at that point, the board of directors steps back. They're no longer involved in the process. An insolvency practitioner takes over the running of the company in the interests of the creditors. What actually insolvency practitioners have been doing in the UK is a so-called light touch. They've been implementing a so-called touch insolvency process, whereby they keep the directors in place. And so the insolvency practitioner still has ultimate liability for what happens, but rather than just completely, creating chaos and disruption and really the end of the enterprise by getting the directors are kept there. So in a way, it's almost a bit like a Chapter 11 type process in the United States, which is very similar. You get relief from your creditors, but the board of directors stays there in place for a period.
Well, that would certainly, be quite a departure in the UK. The Chapter 11 has been around for quite a long time in the States and has been used very effectively to save some quite high-profile companies. So, it's a tried and tested method of keeping a business which should be cash flow viable afloat until either you find someone to rescue it or you're able to sell off some of the assets and build up the position of the business again so that it can emerge from Chapter 11. But this usually takes quite an amount of time. So I guess the question here is, what kind of personal liability do these directors have under this new light touch situation?
Actually, they don't, because the insolvency practitioner at that stage that has full liability. And some of the accounting firms actually haven't been prepared to do it for that reason, because their view is they would have to sort of manage the directors to make sure that they're managing it in the right way. But I think, to me, if we in this current situation, companies are becoming insolvent, the idea that half the economy could be run by insolvency practitioners really doesn't make much sense. So to me, it's sort of pragmatic response.
It's a frightening thought that we might need accountants and lawyers even more than we needed them before. No disrespect whatsoever meant to any lawyers on this call. The situation, though, with insolvency is I think also the sense for the directors involved in insolvency that they have drastically and dramatically failed in some way. And this is where I think there's a big difference between American and European business culture. We find it very difficult in Europe to accept failure. And in the States, I don't want to say that it's rewarded, but it's certainly understood much better than it is here. And, you know, if someone has failed, they tend to find backers in the States from private equity firms and from crowdfunding and from various other sources relatively easily. Whereas we look upon companies or individuals involved with companies that have failed as pariahs. Well, how can we explain this difference? And what's going to change? I mean, is COVID really going to change the way that we think about failure as entrepreneurs and as investors?
I think it's a very it's a tough question, and I think it goes a little bit into maybe the mindset or the psychological makeup of the people involved. I think at least within our cultural context, let's not forget that most companies and most businesses are very small. They're micro businesses or SMEs, and very often the directors are also shareholders. The CEO is possibly the main shareholder. So there's a lot of, I think, personal investment in that company, and there's a lot of the identity of the person that is tied to the success of that business. But I'm no psychologist, but I would suspect that that would be the main difficulty in accepting failure, if we can call it that, because it doesn't have to be seen as a failure. So I think again, we're at a stage of evolution in our corporate culture where perhaps as business owners or as directors or as shareholders or as CEOs, we really need to start distinguishing the identity of the business and the identity of the people who are somehow involved with the business. And we need to understand that sometimes to allow the business to survive, we need to take a step back and allow others to steer forward.
But I think there's also different kinds of failures. I mean, it's this kind of word that I don't like very much, exactly, because it implies that it has to be negative, and it depends on how you define failure. But exactly, if an organization, for example, simply cannot live in the new normal, then it is partly the duty of the directors to realize that and to accept that fact and say we are now. If they take too long accepting that, they will go into insolvency as opposed to into orderly liquidation, right? But sometimes the realization might come too late to be able to do an orderly liquidation, and you simply have to do whatever you have to do. But I think failure for directors, I think they have to be very clear in their responsibilities. And even if there is some leniency around going to court now and around solvency and the procedures and trading, wrongful trading, this is very temporary. It fundamentally doesn't change the legal responsibility of the directors to not be negligent, right? And if they take on new debt or new payment, they have to have a good understanding that they can pay it back, right? I mean, this is not the time to go out and take loans for businesses that are not sustainable in the new normal. But if you haven't even seen clearly what the new normal is, it's kind of hard, right? So I think in these we will see so-called failures, but whichever way we want to want to define that, we will see businesses go down. Is it because of the failure of the director, or is it simply because the new normal does not fit that organization? Is it because the headroom they had given themselves was not big enough for this kind of event? I think we'll see banks coming out. Banks might be leaning around the covenants for a period of time, but when we come back to give any loans, they will probably, I mean, being a banker, right? That's the way I've been trained. We will say, well, actually, companies need to have twice the headroom to what we expected them to have before, so they can withstand another pandemic. Right. I mean, it is just is what it is. So those are the reactions we will see eventually. But fundamentally, failures are the times where you actually learn, right? And from when I was an investment banker, the traders that failed the most spectacularly always had new jobs within a very short space of time, because they had actually proved that they could hold themselves without personally falling to pieces, and then come out in the other side. Yes, there is a loss, but they would keep pushing on. And I think business leaders are strong. Generally, I've met business leaders in Malta. You're strong people, right? I come across seriously strong people that take a lot of personal and professional pain and still shoulder the way through it. And that's why we need to be holding on to that strength, feeding off each other's strengths, even through so-called failures.
You know, coming back on this question of the purpose of corporations or the purpose of business, perhaps this is also demanding a different way of financing business, which it does not have profit as its primary goal. It has other goals which are perhaps more akin to being the goals of what we formerly perhaps thought of as charities or NGOs or other entities, because the modern economy and the startups within it tend to be very purpose driven. So perhaps we need a new kind of lending for these purpose driven entities.
I think there already is a market growing up in that, Edwin. I think the whole social impact financing is certainly a growing area. Green bonds, you know, it's something many people are interested in, and there are investors out there that would have little returns, some level of capital protection, but not necessarily returns other than social impact, measurable social impact. And we all need to be aware of what we add to the bigger picture as organizations. What are we delivering in terms of social impact? You know, with anything any organization would do, what good does it do? And if you can't find any good to do, you should maybe ask yourself whether you want to be involved.
And if I may add just something small to that, Charlotte, correct me if I'm wrong, but it turns out as well that these companies which tend to prioritize impact over profit are, at the end of the day, more profitable. It's just a more of a long-term approach rather than the short-term gains that maybe we're accustomed to.
There's some research that suggests that, yes.
We seem to have lost Roger. He's disappeared. What I wanted to say is that more or less, not only are we nearly out of time, we're actually over time. But I would like to ask each of you one final question, which is, and maybe we could start with Charlotte. If there's one thing that you'd like this Maltese, and I believe we've got someone from South Africa with us and a few other non-Maltese on the call. What would you like our audience to take away from today's discussion? What's the most important thing that you feel we should be taking away from this discussion today?
For me, some of the most important things in this crisis that I have seen as well is how we as human beings we have an ability to be innovative when we need to be. Let us try to draw on all of that innovation that is all around us, that you as a country, Malta, has. Try to bring all of those voices to the table, because the more voices we get, the more people we hear from, the bigger the chance that we will make the right decisions, all of us together. Try to encourage your politicians to be open-minded and take in a broader view around governance, peer governance, about getting these different voices to the table. I think that is absolutely key. And then, as Roberta says, communication, and I know you agree on that. Unfortunately, people have a tendency to communicate less in crisis. We need to communicate more.
Rob, what should our Maltese listeners be taking away from today's call?
Definitely, I fully support everything that Charlotte is saying. Perhaps building upon that just a little bit is partnerships, working together to come up with these new solutions, whether it's working with somebody else within our industry, somebody else from another industry, somebody from a non-profit organization, whether it's government, an advisor. Let's work together, because sometimes we cannot come up with solutions on our own, but if we pool our resources together with our knowledge, our people, our assets, we can really come up with solutions to problems.
That's right.
Roger, do we have you here or not? There was a terrible silence, so that means, Roger, we've lost him. That's all we have time for today, but thanks to Dr. Roger Barker for his input while he was here. Also to Charlotte Valeur for joining today's call, and Roberta, Lepre, thank you for sharing your thoughts today. Thank you for giving us all plenty to think about. I think if we are able to bring more heads together, perhaps we can get some level of sanity into some of the conversations, and hopefully we can come out of this stronger, and perhaps also come out with a better world, because if we learn from what has happened over the past few weeks, hopefully we will all be better prepared with planning to encounter crises. I think there was a lack of preparedness in Malta generally, and we've got many companies here who are ISO certified, and yet they don't seem to have come out with any contingency plan when COVID hit. So that's going back to what Charlotte said at the beginning about everyone having had the opportunity to see this coming. But I'm afraid it was like the freight train. We only heard the sound of the horn on the tracks when it was far too late. So thanks to all of you in the audience for being with us. And we have our next IoD event on Malta's financial ecosystem this coming Thursday at 2 p.m. If you'd like to register, please register with Camilla on the same email address that you registered for this event. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you.